Okay, so the next part that we're going to talk about is organizing the paper overall, right? You know, I explained that you have these different levels of thesisness, right? So you have a main thesis, then you have a part thesis, and then a section thesis, and then a paragraph thesis, right? So now we're going to see it in more detail with this deck of slides on organizing the paper, organizing the essay, right? So I am going to share the PowerPoint so you can see it. Yes, it is. All right, so you should be seeing the paper essay organization slides. Can you confirm that that's what you're seeing?
Yes.
Yes, very good. All right, so now let's say, first of all, if we're talking about any paper at all, it can be organized any which way you want, right? I mean, you know, there's an infinity of ways that you can organize a paper. Now, in some discipline, and some of you may have been taught this for a long time in the English department, they said it has to have 5 paragraphs. It's a 5-paragraph paper. There is the introduction, there is the conclusion, and 3 paragraphs in between. I've never heard of that until I came to this country, but okay. Then in psychology, they are very, very rigid about the order of the section. So you're going to have a lit review, a methodology, your hypotheses, the discussion of the results, sorry, the presentation of the results, and then a discussion of what the results mean. And God help you if you try to put the methodology after the hypothesis. I mean, they just won't accept it in the journals, okay? I mean, they're like rabid about this, okay? But so that's the way you write a psychology paper, okay? Now, in applied linguistics, we are like, you know, fun people, you know, sort of freewheeling type people. So we don't mandate a necessary organization, but there is a sort of basic way of organizing the paper that you do need to follow because it's expected within the American academic style of writing, okay? And basically, this is it, okay, in a nutshell. A simplified version, and of course, it can be made way more complicated than this, and we're gonna see it in a second. But in a nutshell, this is it, okay? So you have an introduction that's optional. Remember I said before, you know, you can have, you know, a few lines or maybe even an entire paragraph that just sets the background, that just says, oh, you know, we're talking about this and that, and, you know, psychology is a great field, you know, that kind of thing, right? Where it's sort of like a generally introductory kind of thing. Then you're gonna have a thesis paragraph that is a paragraph where you said, this is my main point, okay? And then you're gonna have a number of paragraphs, each of which is going to support that thesis or is going to somehow develop a part of the thesis, right? Then you're gonna have a conclusion in which you're gonna repeat your thesis, and then you have the bibliography, right? So that's the structure of the paper, okay? And again, notice how the thesis paragraph at the beginning here and the conclusion here, right, are the same thing, right? They're basically repeating the same thing. Now, not verbatim, you need to change the words a little bit, because otherwise it's repetitious. But otherwise, the content is going to be the same, okay? And as I said, this is a thing, you know, we were talking about this a minute ago, that drives non-native speakers bananas, because it's a uniquely American/British way of writing, and it's very difficult to learn, you know, and so you need to figure it out, okay? Now again, this here we're talking, this slide that you're seeing is the entire paper, okay, in a nutshell, right? So each line is a paragraph, right? Now notice here that I say evidence paragraph N. That means any number, all right? So in other words, you can have 10, you can have 15, you can have 20, you can have 100 paragraphs. Yeah, probably 100 would be a lot, but you know, who knows? Right? In a book, you certainly have that kind of number of paragraphs, maybe even more. Okay. Now, as I said, this is the basic fundamental structure. It can be complicated, right? So here's an example of a more complex structure, right? In which you have basically, again, an introduction, same thing, it's optional, a thesis paragraph that explains what your thesis is, and here you have two sections, right? So it would be like, for example, my paper on the blank face and the other one, right? So where I had two separate sections, right? Two separate things. And so I made two separate points. So one was section 1, the other one was section 2. And then within that, you're going to have a thesis for your section, and then supporting evidence and a conclusion for that section. Okay? Now, notice how each section is really a mini paper. You know, if you look at the previous slides and this, it's the same thing. Okay? So in other words, each section is the same size, is the same organization as the big paper of a simple, you know, in the simple version. If you look here, that's your basic paper, right? Thesis, evidence, conclusion. Here, each section is organized as thesis, evidence, conclusion, right? And then you repeat it. Okay? So basically, it's the same structure except repeated. Now, this is a slide that I stole somewhere, you know, but basically it's a metaphor, and again, is the hamburger organization of the research paper, where you have the opening is the bun on top, then you have your various points, and then you have the conclusion at the bottom. Okay, so that would be your thesis statement would be paragraph 1, and your conclusion would be paragraph 5. And I guess the introduction would be the wrapping, the paper that you wrap your hamburger in if you go to McDonald's, right? That would be, and it's actually a good metaphor, amusingly enough, because the introduction is irrelevant, like the wrapping of your sandwich. You don't usually eat the wrapping of your sandwich, right? You just toss it away. Right? Hey, that's brilliant. All right. So, further complication. Remember, we have here the complex organization with two sections. Now, sometimes people put in transitions. Okay, so here I have put them in red so that they're more visible. Basically, what the transition does is signposting. Remember, we were talking about that before. In other words, you're telling the reader, look, let's look at the transition here, right? You say, all right, so I've given you the thesis. I've given you the introductory discussion to the two sections that are going to follow. Now I'm going to go into section 1. Right? And so you would say, I have now concluded my my introductory discussion, and I will move on to section 1, the blank face. Right? And so you literally tell the reader, this is what is going to happen. Okay? And it's very, very helpful, because that helps you keep track of where it is that you're going and what it is that you're reading. Okay? So here, the transition would say something like, this concludes our discussion of the blank face, and now we move on into the discussion of smiling as a marker of irony. Okay, and so then that gets you into that. Then this transition here would probably say, all right, this concludes our treatment of smiling as a marker of humor. And now we will move on into an overall conclusion. Our overall conclusion is going to be that blah, 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 right? And that's your conclusion that wraps up the entire paper. Okay? As I said, I don't know, can you see this this section here? I think it's a little bit off the slide. That should help. All right. I didn't want to do that. Your transition don't have to be necessarily just chronological. Okay, so sometimes you can do logical transition. Say the conclusion of the previous paragraph leads us to the next paragraph, or sometimes you can do compare and contrast. So you say, well, in the previous paragraph we compared these two things. Now we're going to contrast. So that's one way of doing things. But I mean, it's entirely up to you. It's up to whatever connections you want to highlight in you're passing from one section to the other. Okay. Now, another thing, of course, that we shouldn't forget is that your titles are another way of signposting, right? So that when you say the title of this section is "The Blank Face in Irony," well, that pretty much tells you what it is that you're talking about, right? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that that's what you're talking about, right? So for example, this is a summary of a lecture that I did for another class about politeness, and so you can see this is the summary here. This is it, right? So just look at this. From these three lines, what do you know about politeness that you didn't know before? Politeness theory that you didn't know before?
There were three main waves.
That there were three approaches, three main waves of research on the subject, right? And by saying first, second, and third, it makes it very, very clear how the material is organized, okay? That's what good signposting does for you, okay? Now, the thing to be careful is don't abuse this, because it can be confusing, right? So here, for example, you have an example. Where, so within the classical models, I then say, well, there's actually three models: Lakoff, Leach, and Brown and Levinson. Then Brown and Levinson, which is the most important one, there are three aspects: face, positive and negative, and face-threatening acts, right? So now I am already two levels of indentations in. If I then started to do more signposting, it could become really confusing. Now, in a book, you may need it. In an essay, usually going down more than two is not necessary. Okay, and usually for the kind of work that you're going to be doing, a couple is all that you should need. Okay. Any questions about signposting before we move on? Harry, you seem confused.
Always.
Always, is that what you said? All right. Do you have a question? No? No? You do? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I don't know. No, I'll ask. I don't know.
You'll email me later?
It's not about this page, so it's more general question, I guess.
Okay, then yeah, then why don't you email it to me and then I'll answer via email, okay? All right, so moving on then. Remember we said you start with the introduction, then you have the conclusion, okay? Now, the introductory paragraph, it's not a summary. Your thesis statement is the summary, right? so you're going to have the thesis in it. That's the second bullet point. That's really the most important thing. But you also want to do things like, saying, why is it interesting? Why should anybody care about, reading about the blank face in iron? Okay. What is your goal in writing this paper? What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to do by writing this paper? Okay. Also, you can say, as was the example that I gave you before with the, with the irony paper. Oh, there has been a lot of research about irony, and my work fits in here in this particular branch of the field. Okay, so that's fine, and it's helpful because it gives people a little bit of background so they know what to expect. Okay, but again, don't confuse this introductory. Okay.
Sorry, maybe you can hear this. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, I don't know how to stop it.
But mute yourself.
So
Right. Right. Okay, so yeah. So as I was saying, the introduction is a separate thing, and then of course you have the conclusion paragraph, which again you're going to repeat the thesis that you stated at the beginning. Okay, so it's now, but now it's called the conclusion. And basically you're saying, you've read my paper. This is what I showed in the paper. You're kind of wrapping things up. You're saying, thank you for being with me. This is what I said in the paper, right? So in a very specific sense, it should answer the so what question. It's like, well, why should I have read this paper, right? So you should be able to justify and say, well, so my contribution to the field has been to say blah, 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 blah. So my contribution to the field is to say, well, nobody had really seen the blank face as a marker of irony. I am arguing that it is a marker of irony. Thank you very much. That's my conclusion. All right. Now, then the other thing that you can do, and again, it's optional, it's not a requirement. You can, and it's considered good form, is to say, well, okay, so I've shown X, Y, and Z, but of course, this does not exhaust the total of the research that can be done on this subject, right? That is, in other words, more research could be done on this subject. I haven't said everything that was there to be said, right? So it's considered nice to say, things that remain to be discussed that you haven't discussed and that someone else could, or new avenues of research that your idea has opened up, okay? So in my case, you could say, all right, so I've introduced the concept of the blank face. Now we can look at how does the blank face correlate with other things? Like, for example, does the blank face correlate more with deadpan irony or not? Right? That kind of thing. Okay. All right. So that that is all about the overall organization of the paper, and in a sense, it's all about this lecture. So, are there any general questions or observations that you would like to make? Yes.
Well, I'm a little overwhelmed. One of the reasons is I don't know how many pages I have to even write and how many resources I guess I'm being a high school environment, and we were to more information. So since I haven't written papers so many years,
no, and look, it's perfectly normal. It's a perfectly legitimate question. Unfortunately, the answer that I'm going to give you, you're not going to like. The answer to that is it depends.
Yeah.
Okay, it depends on your topic, and it depends on what project you're doing.
Okay.
So there is no secret number. The answer is not 42. Anybody get the joke?
No.
Too
No?
many pages?
No, Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy. The answer to every question is 42.
42.
Yeah, what is the meaning of life? 42. Well, if you have not read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I strongly recommend that you do
Okay.
yourself a favor and read it. It's very funny, very cute, and you will then understand all the 42 jokes that
Okay.
you hear in the rest of
So
this.
I guess I'm sorry. That's cool. So how do I turn it? Okay. Because I'm trying to narrow down my topics, and which I have, but because I don't know, I guess my fear is, what if I don't have enough information?
That's not a concern.
That's not going to be
I mean,
concern. Okay.
unless you pick the really, really esoteric topic,
Okay.
you're going to have more information that you
Okay.
know what to do with.
Okay.
To be honest with you, most of the time, students will email me and say, you know, there is a word limit of 5,000, or I don't remember what I said, but I think 5,000. Can I go to 7,000 or 8,000, or I've already 9,000 words? What do I do now? You know, so that's usually what the problem is.
Okay.
I have yet to have a student who says, I only wrote 250 words. I don't know what else to write, and has followed the instructions, right? I mean, obviously, if you don't follow so in other words, don't worry about that.
Okay.
You know, quite honestly, don't worry about that. If in a month you still say, I don't see how I can get, you know, a research paper out of this, then we need to talk. Okay? But I really doubt it. And refresh my memory. What is your topic?
I'm leaning right now the attitude, language attitude.
Aptitude. So in other words, how good somebody is at picking up languages.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, there's a ton of work on that.
Okay. Or I might be, but I still have not been able to also I'm interested in doing a bilingual education here in the United States.
Well, all right. Okay. You got to pick.
Cons.
Okay. You have to commit, and now you really have to commit, because you can't have, you know, both things don't fit together. So you either say, I'm going to look at aptitude and what are the components of it and that kind of thing, or you say, I want to look at bilingual ed, and that's a different story. I would go with the aptitude rather than the bilingual.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Other questions?
Where will this be posted?
Say again?
Where will this video be posted? I noticed you're recording it, but
Yes,
I couldn't
yes.
find last week's.
You didn't find it?
No, but I'm, you know, I'm sure it was the operator.
Last week?
I watched last week's. It should be in, if you go into the DL2 Brightspace for this class, you just go into content week 2, and then you should be.
Oh, okay. So it is up. Yeah, that's because I mean I was like I seem to remember putting it up.
Okay.
Then again, you know, I'm absent-minded, you know, that kind of thing. So, you know, would I have been surprised if I'd completely forgotten to upload it? No.
No, I was able to watch it as well, and
Right.
Okay.
I don't recall it being particularly difficult to find. So maybe if you just look back through last week's
It should
materials,
be
it will.
too, and and this will be. I mean, if all goes well, it's up tonight.
Okay.
Texas time. If all goes well. If not, then tomorrow.
No, well, obviously, no. I appreciate that. Thank you.
No, not a problem at all. That's the whole point. So then you can watch it 15 times to enjoy. No.
Well, with my focus abilities.
That would be a punishment. It's like if you misbehave, you know, Shannon, you can do that with the children. You know, if you misbehave, you'll have to listen to Dr. Atarta's lecture 10 times.
You don't stop fighting, I'm going to put you in front of my iPad and you have to watch.
Yeah, exactly. That's. But it could be cruelty to young children. So maybe not. But no, that's kind of the point of having it done like this, is that you can watch it anytime you want, and the PowerPoint should be already be on the website.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't have any questions. I just need to say goodbye because I have to get ready for work. And my
All right, very good. It was nice seeing you. Bye bye.
Shannon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Anything else, or otherwise we'll just end the meeting now?
Is that Whitney? Is that Whitney? Hey, Whitney. I met her at the meeting right before the classes started.
Oh yeah, okay.
And what is your name? What's your name?
Mimi. Hi.
Vivi?
No,
Mimi.
Mimi. I'm Julia. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
All right, then. Goodbye,
Okay.
everybody.
Bye.